In the ancient terrain of the Levant, every hill, every grove, every stone has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. From the Canaanites to the Crusaders, the story of this region is marked by cycles of ascension and decline. Today, we observe a modern state, Israel poised in a similar rhythm. It is not through dramatic collapse that this nation edges toward a breaking point, but through subtler shifts. Ecological overreach, unsustainable geopolitical reliance, and the creeping consequence of becoming an island in an increasingly interconnected world. Much like the overhunting of a species in a fragile ecosystem, Israel's choices have begun to produce pressures that the landscape, both natural and political, can no longer absorb without consequence. To understand the gravity of this situation, we must begin with the land itself. Israel occupies a narrow strip of territory in one of the most resource-scarce regions on the planet. Water, arable land, and energy. Each is finite, each is contested, and each is vital for survival. For decades, the country has attempted to stretch these resources through innovation. Drip irrigation, desalination, solar energy. But even the most advanced technologies have their limits when growth is exponential and when environmental degradation continues unchecked. Aquifers are being depleted. Biodiversity is shrinking. Urban sprawl has devoured what was once fertile ground. The landscape that once sustained pastoral tribes, ancient communities, is groaning under the weight of modern industry and relentless expansion. And when the land suffers, it quietly rebels, not with protest, but with silence, with dust, with dying trees and retreating rivers. Yet it is not only the physical environment that shows signs of stress. The geopolitical habitat in which Israel once thrived has become increasingly volatile. For decades, the country relied on a delicate balance of external support and internal strength. Its security was underpinned by alliances with powerful global actors, especially the United States, and a strategic edge over neighboring states. This alliance system allowed Israel to operate with a level of confidence and sometimes impunity that few other nations in the region could match. But the world has changed. Emerging powers have begun to shift their gaze elsewhere. The United States, once a tireless guarantor of Israel's interests, is now deeply divided internally and increasingly cautious about foreign entanglements. As its influence wanes or redirects, so too does Israel's insulation from consequences. Nature offers a lesson in this too. A dominant species overextends, hunting too aggressively, reproducing too rapidly, consuming too many resources. It inevitably disrupts the balance of its ecosystem. And when external conditions shift, such as the arrival of a new predator or a change in climate, that once dominant species may find itself vulnerable. Its former advantages, now liabilities. In this regard, Israel's long-standing reliance on hard power and strategic deterrence may no longer offer the same guarantees in a region that is rapidly evolving. New alliances are forming, often between historic adversaries. Former enemies are finding common cause. In the new landscape is one of multipolar diplomacy, where flexibility and humility often triumph over rigidity and force. Consider the Abraham Accords, hailed as historic and transformative. Indeed, they were. But even they may not be enough to secure Israel's long-term position if the country remains tethered to outdated models of dominance and exclusion. The truth is, many regional players have begun to pursue their futures without centering Israel. Economic zones are forming. Energy corridors are being redrawn. Trade agreements and defense pacts are emerging that do not always include Israel. The strategic center of gravity is shifting, and in nature, when the flow of water changes, those who once had access to the stream may find themselves parched. Then there is the issue of legitimacy. In ecosystems, dominance does not guarantee permanence. A keystone species maintains its role not merely through strength, but through balance, through supporting the wider environment rather than exploiting it. Israel, in the eyes of many, has strayed from this equilibrium. As global awareness of human rights, ecological sustainability, and social justice grows, so too does scrutiny. The eyes of the world are increasingly watchful, not because of enmity, but because of the shared recognition that the survival of one affects the survival of all. Isolation, once a defensive mechanism, has become a vulnerability. The nation's treatment of its environment, its internal divisions, and its strained external relationships now form a feedback loop. each exacerbating the others. Deforestation and pollution strain the land. Political extremism fractures society, and military entrenchment in contested territories draws condemnation and fuels further conflict. In nature, these are known as stress multipliers. They do not cause collapse by themselves, but together they weaken the organism to a point where it can no longer respond effectively to change. In this case, the organism is the state itself. In recent years, we have seen increasing resistance, not just from traditional adversaries, but from within Israel's own population. Environmental groups protest the destruction of sacred natural sites. Youth movements question the sustainability of endless conflict. Former soldiers speak out about the moral cost of occupation. These voices are not a sign of weakness. They are a symptom of awakening, a signal from the body that something is deeply out of balance. If ignored, they become like the early cracks in a glacier, tiny at first, but deadly if left to spread. Ultimately, the path of unchecked growth, isolation, and environmental neglect is one that every civilization has walked before its fall. The difference today is that we are all watching. We are all witnesses. The global village has made the pain of one visible to all, and the collapse of one corner of our world, be it ecological, political, or spiritual, is a tremor that echoes everywhere. Israel stands now not at the edge of annihilation, but at a crossroads of consequence. It has within its grasp the tools of renewal, scientific ingenuity, cultural richness, historical resilience. But tools are meaningless unless wielded with wisdom. The land is calling for balance. The region is whispering of change. And history, always patient, always clear, is waiting to see whether this nation, like so many before it, will choose harmony over hubris and adaptation over decay. Across the timeline of civilization, it is often internal disintegration rather than external assault that brings about the collapse of a nation. The same holds true in nature. A tree may appear strong and unyielding, but once decay sets in at the core, it becomes vulnerable to even the gentlest wind. In the context of Israel, what we now witness is not merely a crisis of diplomacy or military strategy, but a fracture deep within the social and ideological fabric of the nation. This fragmentation is not loud at first. It begins with difference. It intensifies through distrust. It festers in silence and hardens through denial. And when it reaches a tipping point, the rupture becomes irreversible. In every functioning society, cohesion is built not on uniformity, but on the capacity to contain difference. For decades, Israel managed to balance its multitude of voices, secular and religious, liberal and conservative, Jewish and non-Jewish, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. But now, this delicate equilibrium is tilting. The social contract, once held together by a collective memory of survival and identity, is unraveling under the weight of competing narratives and exclusionary ideologies. The rising tide of internal polarization is visible in the rhetoric of its politics, the fervor of its street protests, and the disillusionment of its younger generations. Like tectonic plates beneath the Earth's surface, opposing forces within the nation are grinding against each other, building pressure that no institution can withstand indefinitely. The judiciary, long considered the cornerstone of Israel's democratic framework, has become a battleground rather than a safeguard. Proposed reforms to weaken the independence of the Supreme Court have sparked massive nationwide protests, not merely because of legal disagreements, but because they symbolize something deeper, a perceived betrayal of foundational values. This conflict is not about law. It is about the very soul of the nation. For some, the judiciary represents the last remaining bulwark against authoritarianism. For others, it is an impediment to religious and nationalistic expression. But what is undeniable is the consequence. A judiciary no longer trusted equally by all becomes ineffective, and a nation without a shared legal conscience slowly descends into chaos. Consider also the growing divide between secular Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community. These are not just differences in belief, but in lifestyle, education, and even participation in national responsibilities, such as military service and taxation. The resentment is mutual and growing. One side feels burdened by obligations. The other refuses to share. The other feels persecuted for its piety and cultural practices. This imbalance is not sustainable. In any ecological system, when one species consumes more resources than it contributes, the system eventually collapses. The same is true in human societies. Equilibrium is essential. Without it, the unity needed for resilience in times of crisis erodes. Among the younger generations, there is a quiet departure, not just physically through immigration, but emotionally and ideologically. Many no longer see their future tied to the fate of the nation. They feel alienated by politics, exhausted by perpetual conflict, and disillusioned by what they perceive as a betrayal of democratic ideals. In nature, when the youth of a species begin to abandon the territory of their birth, it signals a weakening of that group's long-term viability. The future is not passed down like an inheritance. It is chosen. And if enough young minds choose distance over devotion, the cultural continuity that binds a nation begins to dissolve. Further straining internal cohesion is the persistent marginalization of Arab citizens of Israel, who make up roughly 1/5 of the population. Though many contribute to the nation's economy, healthcare, and education systems, they remain underrepresented in political decision-making and are often subjected to systemic discrimination. Their neighborhoods receive less investment, their schools fewer resources, their voices less attention. This creates a dual reality. One state, two experiences, and in any system where inequality becomes normalized, resentment brews silently, becoming a destabilizing force from within. In natural ecosystems, when certain species are excluded from access to water or shelter, the entire habitat suffers, not just the neglected. Balance is lost, and the environment becomes inhospitable to all. The settlement enterprise in the West Bank further complicates the internal landscape. It is not merely a foreign policy issue. It has become a domestic fault line. Some view it as a divine right and a patriotic duty. Others see it as a dangerous provocation and a moral burden. This conflict over land is not about territory alone. It is about identity. It fractures political alliances, divides communities, and fuels ongoing cycles of violence. Every society must choose which values it upholds, especially when those values are in conflict. And in failing to reconcile these opposing visions, Israel finds itself tearing at its own seams, unable to present a unified direction, even to its own people. In times of crisis, nations rely on a shared sense of belonging, a common purpose that binds individuals into a collective. But in Israel, that bond is being tested like never before. The national anthem, the flag, even the very concept of who belongs within its borders, all are increasingly contested. In nature, when a species can no longer identify as a collective, when members begin to act as individuals rather than parts of a greater whole, social animals disband and survival becomes precarious. The same principle applies to human civilization. The erosion of collective identity marks the beginning of a society's unraveling. There is also the rise of political extremism, which feeds on fear and division. When political discourse becomes dominated by those who reject compromise, demonize dissent, and glorify exclusion, the result is not strength but brittleness. A tree swayed gently by the wind is more resilient than one that stands rigid. Flexibility is not weakness. It is a sign of adaptability. And without adaptability, no organism, no society, no civilization survives the changing winds of time. The warning signs are clear. Israel, a nation that has weathered wars, terrorism, and existential threats, now faces a more subtle danger, a collapse of coherence. This is not the work of a foreign enemy, but the product of years of internal division, ignored grievances, and neglected voices. Just as in a coral reef, when the balance between species is disrupted, the reef bleaches and dies. It is not a single event that causes collapse, but a sustained imbalance that is allowed to persist unaddressed. Yet there is still time. The internal fragmentation of a nation is not irreversible. It requires listening where there has been shouting, building bridges where there have been walls, and finding common ground in the soil that has borne so many dreams. The first step is to recognize the fracture, not as a weakness, but as a signal. A call to return to balance, to restore the ecosystem of society. For in the end, no nation collapses all at once. It unravels thread by thread until there is nothing left to hold it together. And if Israel continues down this path of division, it may not fall with thunder, but with silence, the quiet disintegration of something once whole. The natural world offers countless lessons on how systems, long believed to be stable, can shift in subtle yet irreversible ways. In every ecosystem, balance is maintained by invisible threads, interconnected alliances, mutual dependencies, and unspoken codes of cooperation. When one species grows too dominant or one relationship is severed, it sends ripples across the entire web. The Middle East has always been a region of shifting sands, politically, geographically, and culturally. And today, the regional alliances that once placed Israel in a position of unique strength are being redefined. These changes are quiet but profound, signaling a transition in the regional order that leaves Israel more exposed than it has been in decades. This strategic vulnerability, born not from war but from realignment, could become the decisive force in the nation's slow unraveling. For years, Israel has thrived on a doctrine of qualitative military superiority, supplemented by robust alliances with Western powers, particularly the United States. This doctrine allowed Israel to act with relative confidence in the face of regional threats, relying on superior technology, intelligence networks, and rapid response capabilities. But as new relationships begin to form among Arab nations, and as global powers turn their focus elsewhere, Israel finds itself increasingly isolated in a region where it once held the upper hand. Nature tells us that no apex predator remains at the top forever. When the surrounding environment evolves, when prey becomes scarce or competitors more agile, dominance fades. Adaptation is the only answer, but for that to happen, the threat must first be acknowledged. The Abraham Accords, brokered just a few years ago, were heralded as a watershed moment. And indeed, they were historic. But even as Israel celebrated normalization with several Arab states, deeper currents were moving beneath the surface. Many of these new friendships were transactional, driven by temporary alignments of interest rather than shared values or lasting cultural bonds. As regional dynamics shifted further, these relationships began to lose their strategic depth. In a world increasingly shaped by energy politics, infrastructure diplomacy, and digital economies, Israel must compete in arenas where hard power is less relevant. Nations that once viewed Israel as an indispensable partner are now weighing their options, broadening their networks, and building ties with actors like China, Russia, and India, who offer trade, technology, and weapons without political baggage. Meanwhile, Israel's long-standing conflict with the Palestinians continues to shape perceptions across the region. While some leaders may prioritize economics and realpolitik, their populations remain deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. This dissonance limits the durability of any alliance Israel forms. It is not unlike a species that has adapted perfectly to a narrow environment but cannot survive in others. The failure to address the root causes of conflict has become a liability, not just diplomatically, but strategically. As peace becomes more conditional and transactional, Israel's ability to count on regional solidarity diminishes. When an ecosystem loses mutual trust among its species, it cannot thrive. The same is true for geopolitical systems. At the same time, Iran has continued to grow as a regional power, extending its influence through proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Despite internal economic challenges, Iran has shown resilience and adaptability. Its capacity to shape the strategic environment has made it a constant variable in every Middle Eastern equation. The recent warming of relations between Iran and Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, once Israel's implicit partners in anti-Iran posturing, signals a monumental shift. For years, Israel counted on shared animosity toward Tehran to draw closer to sunny Arab states. But if those states are now pursuing de-escalation, Israel could find itself misaligned with the new consensus. In any ecosystem, if a dominant species continues to fight battles that the rest have moved past, it becomes a relic, a reminder of old conflicts no longer supported by the collective. Then there is Turkey, increasingly assertive and unpredictable. Once a military ally of Israel, Turkey has shifted toward a more independent and at times oppositional posture. Its support for Palestinian groups, its growing relationship with Russia, and its influence in the Eastern Mediterranean all contribute to a regional picture in which Israel must navigate more carefully. No longer is it the favored interlocutor or the central node. It must now contend with a web of actors who each hold competing priorities and overlapping interests. This strategic clutter dilutes the clarity Israel once enjoyed. In the natural world, when too many predators enter the same hunting ground, competition intensifies and survival becomes less assured. Even Egypt and Jordan, Israel's two longest-standing peace partners, are experiencing shifts. Their cooperation continues, but it is increasingly transactional and sometimes strained. Popular opposition to normalization remains strong in both countries, and economic pressures have made these governments more focused on domestic survival than on regional grand strategy. This, too, contributes to Israel's vulnerability. It is not that the alliances have disappeared, but their foundation is less stable, their endurance less certain. Nature tells us that relationships built only for survival, without shared purpose, will eventually break down when conditions change. The broader geopolitical stage is also tilting. With the rise of China and the reassertion of Russia, the unipolar moment that once guaranteed American dominance, and by extension, Israeli protection, is giving way to multipolar complexity. In this new order, loyalty is transactional and moral arguments hold less sway. As countries in the region look east, Israel's historic role as a bridge to the west becomes less exclusive. Other nations can now offer technology, trade, and weapons without the political cost that comes with dealing with Israel. In natural systems, when niches are no longer exclusive, competition rises, and once dominant organisms must either evolve or retreat. Adding to this complexity is the growing influence of global civil society. Non-governmental organizations, human rights bodies, and grassroots movements are applying unprecedented scrutiny to Israel's actions, especially in the occupied territories. This scrutiny influences not only public opinion, but also foreign policy decisions in democratic states. It limits Israel's maneuvering space and increases the cost of certain strategic choices. Even friendly governments face domestic pressure to condition support or reevaluate aid. This is the equivalent, in biological terms, of an environmental toxin, one that slowly accumulates and makes certain behaviors unsustainable over time. The organism does not die immediately, but its immunity weakens, its options narrow. The regional shift is not a single event. It is a gradual reconfiguration, like the movement of continents beneath the ocean. You do not see the motion daily, but eventually new mountains form and old landscapes sink beneath the waves. Israel remains powerful, but power alone does not guarantee security. In the long arc of history, those who survive are not the strongest, but the most adaptable. The ecosystem of the Middle East is changing. New actors are emerging. Old certainties are fading. And if Israel does not recognize the new shape of the environment it inhabits, it may find itself alone, still fighting old battles while the world moves on without it. The natural world, in its quiet majesty, teaches us one truth above all: nothing endures unchanged. The great forests, once unbroken and eternal, have withered beneath human hands. The glaciers, timeless in their stillness, now weep into the sea. Civilizations, too, rise with promise and fall with pride. Their stories are etched not only in stone, but in the soil, in the rivers they diverted, in the deserts they created by misjudging the balance between their ambition and the world around them. In this eternal cycle of rise and decline, the signs are never sudden. Collapse does not come like lightning from a clear sky. It comes like the slow retreat of a tide, unnoticed until the boats lie stranded in the sand. Israel, a nation carved from trauma and nourished by resilience, now stands in the arc of history where decline begins. Not by war or catastrophe, but by resistance to change and disconnection from the rhythms that sustain both people and place. In nature, decline often begins with overstimulation. A forest that grows too dense chokes itself of light. A herd that multiplies too fast consumes its grazing land into dust. A coral reef bleached by warming seas does not die in a moment. It fades, cell by cell, color by color, until only the skeleton remains. And so it is with nations. The beginning of collapse is marked not by noise, but by silence, an inability to listen, to adapt, to honor the truths of one's surroundings. Israel's challenge is not merely geopolitical or military. It is deeply existential. The path it walks today mirrors those of civilizations that clung too tightly to ideology, too rigidly to identity, and too proudly to power, unable to see that survival lies not in dominance but in harmony. This harmony so vital to ecological survival, applies equally to human systems. The indigenous peoples of every continent knew this, that the land, the water, the seasons, and the spirit must be kept in balance. Disruption of one weakens all. In Israel, this disruption is now visible in every sector. The land, scarred by concrete and conflict, no longer breathes freely. The water, strained by population and consumption, struggles to replenish. The society, frayed by tribalism and political extremism, no longer speaks in a common voice. And the spirit of the nation, that collective belief in a shared purpose, is flickering beneath the weight of disillusionment and fatigue. Like the mighty empires of antiquity, Rome, Carthage, Byzantium, Israel is confronted with the question that all enduring civilizations must answer. What gives us the right to persist? Is it military might? Economic success? Divine destiny? Or is it the capacity to grow, to reflect, to become more than what we were yesterday? When Rome fell, it did not fall in a day. The collapse came after centuries of overreach, internal corruption, and the erosion of civic responsibility. Roads still led to Rome long after its senators ceased to rule, but the spirit of the Republic had faded long before the final invasion. The same process unfolds today, not through invading armies, but through abandoned ideals, neglected communities, and the slow crumbling of unity. The nation of Israel, born from the ashes of one of humanity's darkest chapters, held within it a profound promise: to be a light among nations. This vision inspired generations, drew support from across the globe, and fueled a society that overcame the impossible. Yet today, that light flickers. It is dimmed not by the shadows of external enemies, but by internal complacency. The belief that survival is enough has replaced the aspiration for moral leadership. The assumption that might makes right has taken root where once there was introspection and ethical reckoning. This is the path of decline, not abrupt but insidious. Nature has no tolerance for imbalance. An environment that favors one species too heavily becomes unstable. In human terms, a society that privileges one group at the expense of another sows its own unraveling. The ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories is more than a political impasse. It is a moral wound. A wound that bleeds credibility, fractures identity, and undermines the very foundation upon which Israel once stood. The illusion that security can be achieved without justice, that peace can be maintained through force alone, is one that history has shattered time and again. Without a reckoning, without a return to the principles of equality and dignity, the structure may remain, but the spirit will decay. In the natural order, collapse is not failure, it is transition. A fallen tree nourishes the soil. A dried riverbed births a new path. But for this rebirth to occur, there must first be humility, recognition, surrender to truth. Israel today faces this threshold. It can continue down the path of resistance, isolation, and denial, or it can step into a new chapter, one not defined by walls and wars, but by the courage to listen, to change, to become something more whole than before. This choice is urgent. Around the world, the winds of change grow stronger. Demographics shift. Climate intensifies. Ideologies evolve. And nations that fail to move with the current risk being left behind, relics of a bygone era, study not for their achievements, but for their refusal to adapt. The world watches not with malice, but with weariness. The patience of allies thins. The curiosity of former admirers has turned to concern. Israel's claim to exceptionalism is being weighed against the reality of its policies and posture. And in that weighing, the scales are tipping. There are those who will resist this message, who will call it defeatist or biased. But nature does not listen to protest. It responds only to balance. When imbalance becomes chronic, collapse is not a question of if, but when. It begins with the farmers unable to irrigate, the youth who no longer believe, the artist who ceases to sing, the mother who no longer sees a future for her child. These are the signs, the real indicators, not headlines or treaties, but the subtle withdrawal of faith from within. And yet within every collapse lies a seed, the seed of renewal. The lesson of nature is not destruction, but rebirth. But rebirth is never passive, demands sacrifice. The shedding of ego, the loosening of old stories, the willingness to see the world not as it was, but as it might yet become. Israel, for all its history, all its pain, all its brilliance, stands now at such a moment where the dream can be rekindled, not through strength, but through wisdom. if it can find the humility to ask what the land needs, what justice demands, what the future truly requires, then the collapse we now observe may become a transformation. But if it continues to cling to superiority, to myths of permanence, to walls built of fear, then it will follow the path of those before it. Glorious, tragic, and ultimately gone. This is not a prophecy, it is an observation. Just as the melting of ice signals a warmer world, just as the silence of birds foretells a poisoned sky, so too do the fractures within Israel signal a deeper unraveling. Whether this becomes an ending or a beginning depends not on fate, but on choice. And nature, ever watching, waits for that choice to be made.